Now, we ended up by talking about belief reaching truth through knowledge, and what we want to do is talk about it in a concrete situation. In both books there are illustrations, so there's a sense in which I'm relying on you to work over those illustrations. But let's exercise ourselves a little bit imaginatively. And again, the point is to notice how much goes on in a conversation about finding the way. Okay, so we raised the problem. You've come out of the front of Seaton and you want to get to Flamingo. And you don't know Halifax. So what do? You've got to meet a reliable person. What do you mean by reliable? You see, so many questions come up. First of all, let's go back to this. I want to introduce you eventually, by the time we get down here, to 4 props or 4 propositions. And this is the first of them. That knowledge is correctly understanding experience, and that gets you at reality. I'm defining the word real now. It's what you get at by correctly understanding experience. What's real? That to which you can say yes. And when you do that, there are lots of problems here we won't handle in this course, but one thing I want you to think about is that when you do that, you don't say it's real for me. Think of it, say, in relation to the light. You wouldn't dream of saying, well, as far as I'm concerned, the light is on in the room. People would say, what? And if you ask directions, and the person said, well, as far as I'm concerned, Flamingo is a club downtown. Okay, it is. No, the thing about truth is that it's detachable. Even in the matter of tastes, you may say, I do not like Beethoven. Now, the next person, you can give truth to the next person in that they don't say, well, I don't like Beethoven. That's not their truth. They can say, you don't like Beethoven. So it's detachable, and that's a basis of the transferability of truth. That when you reach the truth, it's true, and it's true for the next person. The light is on. Not as far as I'm concerned. Okay, it's transferable and it's necessary. We can't live without that. I mentioned the bridge. You can't stop to check out the bridge before you drive across. And if you reflect, if you, for instance, a little exercise, write down 100 things you consider true, and I'm willing to bet that less than 10 of them will be knowledge. 90% at least will be beliefs. Does anyone here know that Ireland is an island? No. You believe it? Okay. Yeah?
So knowledge, correctly understanding experience. So if one was spiraling around to identifying the elements and their own stance within the is and the what, okay, I might not correctly understand my experience. Possibly it's something new to me.
Yes.
So knowing whether or not, how do you define if I've correctly understood my experience?
Like when you're investigating these elements. Yeah, now that
one example.
Pardon?
Well, that's just one.
That's one example, but it's a very good one, and it's a key one in this course. That unlike the Ireland being an island, you can't check that out. But in this course, there's no belief involved, not much anyway. In that you have to check out these yourself. If you remember last day, I talked about your investigation of me, you. Now, if we were doing zoology, you would have to believe an awful lot of the things that I would teach you as a scientist. Science is very much belief. But when I'm teaching you these elements, I'm inviting you to know. So you bring up a very good point there, that this is not a belief situation. In other words, I am here to show you the way that you are, but it has a vast difference from showing you the way to Flamingo or showing you the way to Chicago. Okay? You set out for Chicago believing, yeah? Maybe. But if I invite you to discover the way that you are, you're not a believer. Does that make sense? I'm inviting you not to be believers. Yeah?
What I'm trying to get at is that it says correctly understanding experience. It just doesn't say understanding experience.
Yeah, correctly.
So what against can I measure whether or not I've correctly understood it?
That's the tricky thing that comes up here in this foundational complexity. In other words, you're not measuring it up against something else. You simply have to do this inside as best you can. Yeah? You can't sort of go out and say, well, I'm going to check it against what's out there. I think that's your puzzle. Yeah?
And another thing I wanted to mention earlier when you were talking about the creative interest, and you can only do that within yourself. Well, to the degree that you recognize your own stance when you're whiting or ising, can you not reach towards someone else's reaches and understand, or try to reach their understanding, which would then enrich your own? So you can't explore it into someone else.
Yeah,
to the extent you have an understanding of your own, identified some properties.
Yeah. Now push that. Yeah, that is the way you get at it. But let's think of it in terms of, say, Wealth of Self, Chapter 5, that you're condemned to solitary confinement within your own skin. The wonder of the other person, which you want to get at, okay? You want to appreciate their wonder, their creativity, their interest. You can't get inside their skin. They can make noises. They can give you clues. But you have to reproduce that internally. Yeah? And then you're able to say, I know what you mean. Yeah? That brings us into this question of the personal complexities. But it's right on that, yeah, how do you appreciate the other person? Not by having 20/20 vision.
I realize appreciation of myself,
yeah.
I can't have it with somebody else. Yeah. But to the extent that I have it myself, I can. You
can appreciate the other person, but there's no question of you sort of looking at them closely or touching them or whatever. It's a component in knowing somebody. Touch, taste, smell, etc. But understanding their curiosity primarily depends on you being curious and understanding your curiosity. And then you're able to say, if somebody makes the noise to you, I'm really curious about, you're able to say, I know what you mean. Why? Because you're like that. You have become human enough to appreciate the other person. Yeah? Now, we'll get into more of the complexity further down. But let's stay at the moment on this very elementary process of trying to get somewhere. In the book, I talk about trying to get a place in New Delhi. But whatever city you're in, think of somebody trying to get somewhere. You're downtown Halifax and you want to get to Flamingo. What do you do? Now, concretely, you approach a uniform, say. Many of you would think of that, yeah? You have a whole set of presuppositions about who you might ask. Yeah? The old story of the man coming out, say, looking for Flamingo, and he comes out of the liquor store, and there's one of these old guys outside sort of swaying around. And he says, well, I think you go up that. No, I think if you went across, no, you can't get there from here. Okay, you go to somebody, and now what I want you to notice is the subtlety of your moves. You go up to somebody, they're standing at a bus stop, say, and you say, could you tell me how I'd get to Flamingo? Now, if you're alert, you're doing certain things very spontaneously. The first thing is, you may notice a sort of a 2-second pause, the hesitation in a person, and you know immediately that you're not going to follow their directions. And many of you have been directed like that. The person stops and sort of looks reflective, and you let them talk, and sometimes you find that they're telling you to stay at the same bus stop and take a certain bus, and you know it's the wrong bus, and you're not sure what to do, and you're hoping their bus will come first, because you know that, no, I don't take a number 20 down to and transfer and get a number 9 and end up at the bottom of the park. This is operating sensibility, body language, interpreting the hesitancy. And there are, you can make this very precise, but I'm trying to get you at the general sense that, is the person telling the truth? Is the person speaking truly? Is the person mistaken? They're all different shades. The most difficult situation is when the person is really mistaken. It's very hard, and they come out with enthusiasm. I love recalling doing this once. When I was writing this book process, I was in Oxford, and I recall walking towards the library one day, and a big trucker pulled up and asked me how we'd get to Abingdon. And like a flash, without really reflecting on it, I said, oh, you're going in the wrong direction. You have to turn down and go straight down to the Carfax, and you swing. And, no hesitation whatsoever. And so he maneuvered his truck around the road and off down. And as I strolled along the road, I realized, oh God, he was going in the right direction. So needless to say, I swung down a side road immediately. I didn't want to meet this trucker on the way back. But when the person is mistaken, it's very hard to detect. Now, then you have the con artist, or the person that just loves sending people off in the wrong direction. Any of you like that? Yeah? The person's looking for, say, Flamingo, and you send them down, take the 12 downtown, and then transfer to the number 9 and get another transfer. And when you get out at the park, wait. I have some weird acquaintances like that who do nasty things like that, misdirect. But the point is that you are listening, you're asking, what's the person saying? Am I really hearing it? Okay, and you're assessing them and what they're saying. It's not just what they're saying, it's the body language, the stance. I take buses when I do travel around town, and it's marvelous to watch the body language of people contradicting their mouths. Like you see two people moving up towards one another, and they greet each other, and they didn't want to meet each other, and they're saying how, oh, it's nice to see you, and their feet are almost turning round. Yeah? So you're alert to that. What am I going to do? And the key question is not, am I going to Flamingo this way, but am I going to accept their truth, or what they say as true? That's the key element in believing. It's not verifying, it's not checking out, it's not, I'm going to go to Flamingo and see is this person telling lies, which we'll come back to next week, where you actually, yeah, go for it. And so you're outside the mount, and you head up past Melody. Okay? And you do make that jump. Now, you have to think about this. I recall having a very skeptical student once who said, I never accept it until I get there. Now, that's not really true. Think of, for instance, you're wandering along the cliffs in Crete, and you want to have a dive into the ocean, and you meet an old guy standing on the top of the cliff, and you say, is it safe to dive here? And he says, well, the last time I dived it was. Well, you say, well, when was that, eh? Second World War. But the point is that if somebody says it's safe to dive, you don't wait until you hit the water. Yeah? Oh yeah, it's not safe. So belief is a jump you make on the spot with regard to some presentation. Okay? And it's a jump. And you have to be alert. In process, I mentioned coming staggering out on Connaught Place. It's a big circular boulevard in New Delhi, and you just come out of the Volga restaurant, which is on the north side of it. And you know, you're a little pickled, and oh, how do I get to Hoonaman Road? Well, you're in no condition to come up with, yeah. How many of you, well, I won't ask how many of you have come staggering out of someplace. I had a friend once who took a number 20 bus into town, and he ended up out late at night out in the, you know, way down the shore. Okay, so it's alertness, it's going through these elements, and it's making this jump. And that is the jump that gives you the yes of the decision. I'm not going into the technicalities here. There's an insight that grounds the judgment of decision to accept. What happens? The yes gives you another truth. You are saying this is the way to Flamingo. So you get at truth not by coming up through these, but by accepting from somebody else a truth that they have. Now, they may have it from somebody else. The person you ask says, I don't know, but I've got a map. Now, so you're both believing the map. Okay? So it's a different type of nodding. I mentioned that I would come back to the question of nodding here. And really, our focus right through these weeks is on nodding. And let's nail down the types of nodding we're interested in. There's a nodding of yes, I know the light is on. Okay? There's a nodding of yes, I know that Ireland is an island. And that's the nod of belief. Okay? And then there's a nodding that is next week's topic, and that's the nodding of yes, I know that my Redeemer liveth. I am saved in some sense of that word, whether it's the Hindu, the Shintoist, the Taoist, the Jewish, Muslim, Christian. It's a conviction based on a type of believing. And the key jump will be, again, the same. Now, we'll spend a lot of next week on that. But my primary interest is in inviting you to think concretely about you in the street, and to discover that believing, accepting truth from somebody else is a complex operation. You hear, you understand the instructions, you know that you've heard them correctly. You're not there yet. What are you going to do? And that question is not directed at the directions, but at the speaker. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's, what am I going to do in relation to this person? Is this person having me on? Any stray questions on that? Yeah? So there's the jump of belief, and then you find your way. Now, it's the simple process of finding your way. What are we trying to do here? We're back to the previous question. We're not trying to find our way to Flamingo. We're trying to find our way of finding the way to Flamingo. Does that make sense? It's the double thing that I keep bringing back. This is detective work. Anyone who's been lost in a foreign city knows that this can be hilarious detective work. You go up to somebody in a foreign city and, you know, it's sign language. Or sometimes in Halifax, one of these foreign sailors comes up. You haven't the foggiest what language it is. And it's, you know, gestures all the way. I remember one lady talking to me about wanting to get to Ottawa. I said, oh, what? Ottawa! Ottawa in you know, Canadian. Okay, so it's detecting, and we're trying to detect a certain type of detecting called believing. Okay? So there's a sense in which we're two-thirds of the way in the essentials of the course. Reason and religious belief. We've talked about reason. Believing is a particular use of reason. And religious belief is a particular type of jump, which we'll have to get into next week. Any comment on that? There's got to be a 64-cent question somewhere. Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, it may come up under the next section here, which is complexities. These two propositions will come back when we get to foundations, and I will add two more. Okay, but first, a few comments on complexities. Well, the first comment is that what we've been doing is the core part of the course. What is reason? It's the operation of these elements in me. What is believing? It's that operation insofar as it relates to truth which I don't have and I need. And next week, religious belief. Now, complexities, this really is related to those who have the energy to pursue the complexities. But it's also related to normal introductory courses in fields like physics, mathematical physics, that you invite people to notice the relevance of what happens if, larger perspectives. It's an encouragement towards pushing on. If, I use the analogy of chemistry and music. If I was teaching you music, if you've done music, say, with the piano, there is a way of teaching the piano which is murder. That you actually start with the scales, okay? And you play the scales. You play the 13 up and down with C major. And then you do it with two hands. And then you do C, well, you don't do C sharp, you go up and do G next. And then you move to D and A and so on, and eventually C sharp and so on. And you just do scales all the time. Yeah? And after a year, what are you doing? Well, you're playing the whole 13 scales and then the majors, minors, and the melodic minors. Yeah? And it's hard work, and no good piano teacher does that. What do? They introduce you to playing the Blue Danube after a month, yeah? Or Three Blind Mice, or something exciting like that. Okay? There's a sense in which, yeah, you point to complexities, or you encourage an effort in the complexities, so as to encourage the person to do the elements. The child has no appreciation of the fact that, why do I have to get my thumb into the habit of going under? Or why do I have to do exercises like that? And then you find, oh, this occurs in one of Chopin's nocturnes. Oh, well then, that is a motivation. Okay? So don't be discouraged by the complexities is a main point. Those of you who are struggling with 5 credits. Those of you who are doing only 1 credit, well, get right in. But still don't expect to be playing Chopin's nocturnes in the 4th week. Okay. So the personal complexities, we've touched on some of them already. Yes, we can use this diagram. And it relates to Tim's question of appreciating the other person. We discussed Helen Keller and her discovery of language and her discovery of the use of words. Okay, that's what the shift was, that she used the sign for water. She made a sign, I'll put it in inverted commas, and I raised the question then, what did she mean by water? And I suggested that by water, a person doesn't mean what's in the glass, what's in the tap. What a person means by water is something internal to the person. Now that's very difficult to figure out. Words point inwards. Does that... In the book I talk about, say, Glenn Gould crouching or Nijinsky crouching. What does the word crouch? If Glenn Gould says to somebody, I generally only play when I'm crouching over the piano. What does crouching mean? It means all of Glenn Gould's past crouchings. Yeah? And there's that complexity of the assumption that you know what the other person means. Does that make some sense? When Glenn Gould says, I crouched over the Goldberg variations, yeah?
So the word points inward to all the understandings of my experience of.
Yes, and not just the understandings, but all the levels. The sense of crouching. Yeah? I recall the famous dance of Nijinsky, the dance of the rose, the spectre of the rose, where finally he crouches, it's a sort of a pause, and he leaps through the window. And there's a famous account of him leaping through the window from the crouched position. And one person says, he wasn't just above the ground, he was near the stars. Yeah? Now, so it's not just his understanding. There's a sense in which the great artist is not pushing for understanding. It's an embodied reality. Yeah? So that the word means something that's quite beyond us. Okay? Now, the complexity with persons is that Molly and Poldy are like that, living daily with one another in separate worlds. This is a very difficult notion. It's discussed to some extent in chapter 3 of Process. And the problem is to be open to the strangeness of the other, as I try and point out. And not to nod your head and say, oh yeah, I know what you mean. You meet somebody and they're in deep suffering over such and such a thing, and you say, oh, I know what you mean, I lost $5 last week. Huh? So there is that difficulty of the personal, that the words point inwards to a meaning that's hidden and mysterious. In this context, I love quoting that very strange German Rilke, who talks about love. What is love? Love consists in this, that two solitudes guard and bind and greet one another. And again, he says about marriage, the successful marriage is one in which each is the guardian of the other's solitude. So that Molly and Poldy, if you like, talk foreign languages to each other. And there's the massive mistake of sliding into a familiarity. We're back to the question of a creative interest in creative interest and the notion of reason as dim. I talked about it as a dim light. So that there are real grounds for Molly saying to Poldy, you are wonderful. You're quite beyond me. Now that's a personal complexity, and one could build up on this if you take, say, and it leads me forward to the socio-historical thing, but take the personal in the context of a very elementary little book written by Karen Horney, 1937, but it's still right on, about the neurotic personality of our time. Take it in the context of the songs of the 60s, Bob Dylan and Paul Simon. People talking without speaking, hearing without listening. And I like to add, reading without minding, living without minding. So that words are exchanged. Okay, now you can put that back into the, yeah?
Another toughness about this is not just as much the doing, it's the loneliness, the dim embodied loneliness brightens up. And I find it sort of opens up a vulnerability like to despair.
Yes, yes.
That kind of thing. Because when you're really into that, and then if there's no one else that you're in with,
oh, you're normally at your
then you really notice how people don't really notice you.
Yes.
And then you feel like it's me and all this weight, and here I am floating around.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You feel you're nuts. There's a famous novel with Patrick White and the strange lady traveling through America, and they all think she's crazy. And yeah. So there is that problem that. But there is that problem that, like Carl Jung's notion of being optionally neurotic.
Rather than functional.
Yeah, rather than functionally neurotic, yeah. But to notice the massively organized neurotic structures that Karen Horney talked about at that period, they're related to Sorokin's view of a sensate culture, what I talk about as talking animals. Lonergan talks about linguistic education. We're educated to talk and merely talk. Yeah? So you
a strong ground. Grounded somewhere, then that vulnerability, I found dangerous.
yeah, that's where the other jump comes in, the jump of faith, where you can make that jump, and you're in a context which is beautifully expressed by the strange woman Julian of Norwich. All thing is well, and all manner of thing is well. Yeah? But that's a tough leap. And the neurotic personality of our time that has no deep self-respect is shockingly vulnerable to developing a neurosis into psychosis and so on. Yeah? But the neurosis that can be so beautifully disguised is the one that's suited in the culture. Both suited to and suited in. Yeah. There was a program last night with blacks telling black jokes. Well, what's black with a suit on? What do you call a black with a suit on? The defendant. The required image, yeah? You get neurotically out, but also you cater to the neurosis in the other. You're going for an interview in a certain company. You don't go in your jeans. One of my students was going for an interview the other day, and he was sitting in class, and the knee was missing out of his trousers. And I said, for God's sake, you know, you've got to change before this interview. So you have to live in a culture that has very strange views of what normal humanity is. Yeah, here's that word again. Okay, so the complexities on the personal level are like familial structures. I mentioned my colleague talking about the disorientations of families, especially in the patriarchal tradition and so on. When you move to the socio-historical, what we need is a larger canvas that I intimated at the very beginning, talking about outer space and the history of the universe. Our solar system, 10 billion years old, and you walk back and you realize, my heavens. Okay, what is helpful here, and again, it's the complexities that I'm inviting those who have leisure to pursue. If you, this second point, number 3.2, the socio-historical, you'll get some help if you reflect on stages and structures. Okay. You'll find a diagram on page 203 of process, and you'll find an array of terms on page 83. And it's worth pausing over this diagram, even at this stage in the course. You'll find that at the bottom of that page, there's a line. The upper part we will deal with, it's related to chapter 4. But the bottom part, there's a line, and it's worth reflecting on. I mark it with dates, minus 1000 BC, and plus 2500 AD. You needn't worry about the things in between. The point here is the incarnation in the Christian tradition. This strange, awkward Jew, unemployed carpenter, drop out. Okay, this is a period which I call a second stage of humanity, as opposed to a first compact stage and a later stage, a third stage. For present purposes, let's just call it a stage based on or mediated by self-discovery. In other words, people understanding the elements of being human. Now, you can see I'm a long-term optimist. So here we are at the end of this gruesome century, and it's dominated by neurotic self-neglect. I mentioned truncated subjects, neglected subjects, people not knowing themselves. I illustrated it by inviting you to investigate indices to books on human beings. The dictionary I mentioned earlier on. That in fact, the topic of quest and question is not a topic in most fields of human study. In other words, there was a bit of advice that emerged at the end of that marvelous century of Greek drama with Sophocles, Aeschylus, and then Euripides as a sort of a coming down, where Socrates emerges with this notion that the unexamined life is not worth living. That advice has not been taken. I think of Chesterton's comment on Christianity. Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It has been found hard and not tried. Similarly, self-discovery. There's a discussion of the discovery of mind by a man called Bruno Snell, the discovery of mind by the Greeks. And I recall rolling into Piraeus, which is the harbor about, I don't know, 10 miles away from Athens, thinking about this one morning, and it dawned on me that the Greeks did not discover mind. 3 very weird Greeks discovered mind, and it never got into the culture. So the problem we have is to review the Western tradition as a tradition that somehow is fragmented and self-neglectful, and eventually moves up to the arrogance of what's called the Enlightenment, God help us, where you get a sort of rationalism that's just nominalism. And then the myth of progress in the 19th century, where we killed off that one in the last century. Okay, so this is a larger viewpoint. And it's very difficult to get at. And it's not the sort of thing you're invited to do. It's not the perspective of political speech. You celebrate the 2nd century of America, or 200 years America, Australia, whatever. That's losing sight of the long history ending in the misery of the Machiavellian structure of American politics. Okay, so there's a longer view that complexifies this. What are we doing about it here? Nothing. The old French slogan in retreat was "Sauve qui peut." Save yourself, and maybe your kids, your classes. The structures that have emerged, and we'll talk about the structure shortly, are such that the orientations I talked about at the beginning, we used to use the phrase in Ireland, having a snowball's chance in hell. Is that a familiar? Yeah? So in other words, if you go back to the 5 levels we discussed, and the reach of child, middle-aged, adult, elder, the reach for beauty, what's the pressure? Pressure is consistent ugliness. The great illustration of that is the emergence of the Bauhaus tradition in architecture, German working houses, that it swept through North America. Downtown is full of it, yeah? Big boxes and little boxes. So ugliness, a pressure of ugliness, killing off sensibility. The yearning for understanding, what is it met by? Memorization, use of words, the polysyllables of politics. What is the yearning for truth met with? Well, an exercise I sometimes give students is to stand at one of the main crossroads and watch all the lies that pass you. You know, this bread will make you live. Without this underarm spray, you cannot live. We just take it for granted now that we live in a world of lies. Yeah? Instead of the excitement of adventure, well, it's just boredom. One of my students said that she never goes to a party without having a few beers. Can't tolerate her friends until she's a bit lit up. So there's a pressure of boredom. And intimacy, yeah, worthwhileness. It's not a topic. Again, I quote Lonergan, Method and Theology, page 99, where once there was joy and sorrow, now there's just pleasure and pain, and the civilization has become a slum. Now, one way of noticing that is to just take an hour or two or a week to look at the list of words on this page. I just touch on it because it helps us to notice the difficulty of doing this. Okay, what is the structure I'm talking about? In most books on theories of sociology, you get a structuring of how to examine society. It gives you the structure of, say, sociology of knowledge and belief, motivation, that sort of thing. This is a set of terms that helps one approach the study of society. What you have to think of now is the long period, the stages I'm talking about, and somehow structures that can be approached from this perspective. Let's put down a few of the terms. The human being is a capacity and a need that has operations and can move to cooperations that result in particular goods. Okay. Two people can cooperate to cook a decent meal. And the human being is plasticity. In a way that the chimpanzee isn't. You may get performing animals, but none of them have played Beethoven's sonatas yet. And that results in developments and skills. And these fit into institutions through the roles and the tasks of these people, producing what you might call a good of order, a situation, a social situation. That's a handy little set of terms that can help us talk about society. Okay, and I'll add in the bottom just to finish this off. The human being is free, and that freedom is not the power of doing good and evil, it's the freedom on all these levels to expand, to envisage a variety of dinners, not just to settle for pizza. Okay, there's liberty, and here we are with the word orientation, which I've been talking about, and conversion. And these can lead to personal relations. And the entire setup is oriented towards terminal values. Heavens above, time is running away. Are you free until... Have you a couple of hours to spare? Okay. Now, we'll get back to this later in the course, but I want you to think about it now because I'm trying to get you to notice yourself in the concrete, like Molly Bloom in 1904, like Helen in a university where she couldn't study, like Husserl, like Einstein eventually getting to America and saying it was very hard to get an education in my time and now it's impossible. Found out how to get a job. Okay, he got a job on June 16, 1901, just 3 years before Bloomsday. Okay, the point is that if you look at sociological analyses, they have something like this, but this is empty. There's knowledge and there's belief and motivation. These are within the human subject. What are they? We don't ask. Some sociologists won't even discuss the word knowledge apart from sort of a reflex. What we're trying to do against the tide, against the stages, is to indicate that that is this dynamic. That dynamic can, through liberty, move to the orientations of the real human beings that we subtly admire and generally avoid, like Mozart, Picasso, and so on. So the difficulty is that insofar as you're trying to come to grips with your own capacity and needs which make you human, the quest, you're up against the massive structures of institutions that have evolved in the last, I have an article here about the notion of domination and the meaning of kingship in the New Testament, and the fact that 3,000 years before Christ there were institutions that emerged that have colored the West since. that have colored Christianity. But it's quite a heavy reflection to figure out what are the institutions of decay. Yeah? Could it be true that the Roman cardinals are barely Christian? I don't know. I only met a couple of them. So the problem of self-discovery is that you are in an existential situation where everything is against you. And that's part of your business. Why develop sensibility and sensitivity when you're going to be crushed? Yeah? You feel too much. You're like Blake. You don't see the sun anymore, you see the Hallelujah chorus. So that's the existential problem of discovering, sadly, the deep loneliness and the quality of desire. That somehow we've managed to create structures that are alien to the human subject. Any comment on that? The key point, if you are studying in the field of sociology, the key point is to go and see what the great people, whether it's Parsons or whatever, think of the human subject. Are they allowing for any of these elements? I mentioned Parsons because the Parsonian perspective finds it very hard to handle development and conversion, shifts in culture. Why? Because a shift is grounded in questioning, basically, on the human level, not on the evolution of animal level. Now you have to imagine the institutions. They're not buildings, they're subtle forms. Oh, they can be buildings. You can build in such a way that you're oppressing people, like the Bauhaus. But they're institutions of conversations, of ways of talking. The institutions of, say, newscasting, television interviewing, political discourse. Yeah? And it's interesting to listen to the institutions whereby you're deceived. Now, I think of all sorts of funny details, but I don't want to get into them. Any comment on that? Any suggestions, questions about? I presume most of you know what role-playing is, and yeah? You can't be getting through life without playing some roles. Yeah? Okay, so, pardon?
Playing a student.
Yes. Yes, Bernard Lonergan used to say, never try and teach a professor anything. Okay, so the problem in this structure is not knowing the terminal values, us, and not knowing the beginnings. Yeah, we have either the alpha or the omega. Yeah. Now I can put that, and because it's at the end of chapter 1, I should put it in, relating it to the quest of. We're talking about the quest of ourselves. But at the end of chapter 1 and at the end of chapter 5, I have two sections, the quest of Sherlock Holmes and the quest of Jesus Christ. And I talked last day about the mind of Christ. And the point I was making is that if you're talking about the mind of Christ intelligently, you should know what a mind is. Now, when I use the word the quest of, and I talk about the mind of Christ at this stage, I'm not talking about interpreting the New Testament. I'm not talking about the huge history that Schweitzer, I have his autobiography here. Schweitzer settled down at one stage Again, 1904, 1905, he published his great book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, in 1906. He was hard at it in 1904, and he said he piled up the books around his room, all the books from Reimarus on, and he decided, I'm going to work at these books. Now, it's a huge problem, and we'll touch on it later. But what we're searching for at the moment is the nature of mind, whether Sherlock's or Jesus's. And you will find, if you go back to the New Testament, that there are. Yeah? Am I going up to Jerusalem? What do men say that I am? And so on. So that you don't know what you're reading if you don't know what a mind is, and you can't find out what a mind is without finding out what your own mind is. Does that make some little sense? Now, the culture is such, again, and you'll find it spelled out here, that Sherlock Holmes, when Sherlock Holmes talks about detecting, he uses my first definition of reasoning. He keeps talking about deduction and logic, and that's not how you do it at all. He's an arrogant so-and-so, in fact, yeah, likable in his own way. But there's a sense in which Miss Marple is much better. There's a famous, well, not a very, well, one of the stories of Miss Marple is, I think it's the 420 from Paddington, and she eventually solves the crime, and somebody says, how did you do it? Oh, well, it's like Mark Twain telling the story of the lost horse. You imagine you're a horse and you go where the horse might go. Yeah? Miss Marple is much closer to this. But when you get to Sherlock Holmes or Poirot, you find that they're talking about deduction. Now, what I talk about here is the autobiography of Conan Doyle. And you will find, if you read these detective stories, The Moonstone is the one I start with, Wilkie Collins, that in fact, while occasionally they talk about detection fever, etc., when the detective talks about solving the mystery, the detective is using the wrong view. It's inherited. I'm trying to bring out the fact that there's a pressure within the culture, within language, within even detective literature, towards giving you the wrong view on human wonder. Okay? Now, we still haven't handled this truncated problem, or this foundational problem, which relates to your question of the other and observing the other. So we'll just have to leave that hold, and I'll end by pointing out that exercise, page 47 of Process. You find something on your door, it's a design. When you go home, you have 5 why reactions to it if you're alive. That's your problem.